Well, as the study of most complex interactions go, this one began with a natural history observation. Back when I was a beginning graduate student, back in 1962, I was down in southern Mexico in the state of Veracruz, which is right here, collecting insects for the California Insect Survey. And I was there because I wanted to look for tropical ecological interactions to do my thesis research on. And one day I was walking down a road, and a small bush, more or less like this one, but perhaps a little taller, was standing there, and a beetle flew by and landed on one of the leaves. The instant that the beetle landed, an ant ran up and grabbed the beetle. The beetle jumped off the leaf and flew off. And I saw this happen, but it really didn't sink in. And I walked on down the road, and the little wheels began to turn. And after 2 or 3 hours, it suddenly hit me that there might be some real reason why the ant was there. So I turned and I walked back to the bush, and there were ants walking all over the surface of the plant. So I picked up a few insects and threw them on the plant, and the ants attacked them. They jumped off, and then the immediate question came to mind as to why the ants were there and what they were doing there. The breakthrough came, as often one expects it to come, through a sort of serendipity. I was out collecting large trees, not little ones like this one, but very large trees, to take home to open up the thorns and see what was inside of the ant colony. And I cut some down and left the tops next to the stumps. And other ones I cut down and dragged the crowns of the trees back to the house, not thinking too much about this difference. Well, nearly 2 months later, I walked back through this same pasture and first got to the stumps where I had cut the tops down and dragged them into the house. And there we had a little stump with a small amount of sucker regrowth from those stumps. And then I walked on through the pasture and came to the place where I cut down the tops and left the crown of the tree sitting next to the stump. And the difference was very conspicuous. These small stumps had very tall and very healthy looking sucker shoots growing from them, something like the one in front of us. Now, the conspicuous difference was that the ant colony was still there, and it had moved back into these sucker shoots just as it had lived in the normal plant. Now, that obviously then sets you up for an experiment, which is to compare what happens to the plant when it has its ant colony and what happens to the plant when it doesn't have its ant colony. But now, before we can really do this kind of an experiment, we have to understand a good deal about the natural history of the plant itself and the animals themselves, i.e. the ants. Because if we don't understand that, then often you can set up a very elegant experiment which doesn't yield any results, because the biologies of the animals and plants were all wrong for that experiment. So what I'd like to do now is tell you about the detailed biology of the plant for a short period of time, and then we'll move on to the ants a bit later. Now, as far as the plant is concerned, the important characteristics that we have to deal with are, first, sort of where it lives. And on this map, we've marked in a darker color where the acacia, the plant, with its ants, is found throughout Central America. Now, these are different species of acacia in different areas and different species of ants, but the interaction is pretty much the same throughout. And basically what this is what's called the Tierra Caliente, the hot lowlands, and it's an area where the plants grow very rapidly in early stages of succession after the vegetation has been cut, cleared for a cornfield or lumbering or some other thing like this. The plants are growing rapidly. They are competing very strongly with other plants, and as we'll see later on, the ants play a very important role in that competition. Well, at any rate, this is where they live. And the other thing we need to understand is what the plant actually does for the ants. And what it does are 4 things. The first thing is these large thorns, which you can even see on this small young seedling that we've grown in the pot. These large thorns are enlarged stipules that, on other acacias that aren't involved with ants, function basically as protective devices for the leaves. And in those other plants, the leaves are short and the thorns are usually long, and we can see that a browsing mammal might be deterred to some degree from feeding on the plant because of the long thorns. But in the acacia, through a process of coevolution, we've ended up with an inflated thorn in which the ants are living. So that's the first thing. The second thing are food bodies called Belchian bodies, which are on the tips of the leaflets, and really what they are modified leaflet tips, which contain a very high concentration of proteins and lipids and vitamins. And the ants clip these off, cut them into pieces, take them inside the thorns, and feed them to the ant larvae. Now, these food bodies are not produced new on the leaf after they've been clipped off. The bodies themselves are actually part of the leaflet, and there's no more growing tissue there. So when they're removed, that's it. So if the plant is to feed the ants continually, it has to keep producing new leaves. Now, the third trait that's produced by the ants is that, by the plant, excuse me, is that the leaves have small nectaries on the petiole, which produce every day a small amount of sugar. And this is harvested by the ants, usually very early in the morning, and that's where the ants get their sugar sources. So they're getting sugar from the nectaries and the proteins, vitamins, and lipids from the Belgian bodies. Now, as you might have guessed by now, the fourth trait is that the plant stays green throughout the dry season. You may remember that the plant occurs only in the lowlands of Central America, and these are areas that have a very severe dry season. And if the plant dropped its leaves at that time, the ant colony could probably starve through the dry season, but it would be very small when the rains came, and then it would be of very little use to the plant when the rains did come and the plant put out a new set of leaves. Now, up until this time, we've been talking about what the acacia does for the ant colony, but we have to ask, what is the large mature ant colony doing for the acacia? Now, there are two things. One is that in the vegetation where these plants grow, there are a large number of plants that are climbers, like your bindweed. Now, these plants act by going up the plant and covering it over. And what happens when one of these plants encounters an acacia is that the ants, when the plant touches it, clip off the end of the climbing plant. In this way, the plant is free of these plants. The second thing that they do is whenever another plant begins to grow up nearby and sticks a branch into the crown of the acacia, they also cut the end of that off. And the result is that the acacia is sitting in a hole in the vegetation with no other plants around it. And of course, what this does for the acacia is that it frees it from competition, both by shading and perhaps to some degree root competition from these other plants. Now, the second thing that the ants do is that any time an animal, be it a little bitty insect or a cow or a human being or what have you, actually touches the acacia, the ants then run out on that structure and begin to bite and sting it. But they do it in a very special sort of way. Instead of grabbing a hold as a predaceous ant would do and trying to kill the prey item and drag it back into the acacia, they bite, they sting, and then they let go and run around and do it someplace else over and over and over again. Now, here you can see a worker stinging the back of my hand in the usual manner. It first grabs a hold with the mandibles and then bends the abdomen under and runs the sting in. It commonly only holds on for a few seconds when it does this, and then lets go and moves to another part and repeats the process. This worker is rather excited, and so it may not behave entirely normally. Now, what this does is creates harassment rather than actual lethal effects on the animal. And what this means is then that the ant colony is more effective at keeping off persistent things than it would be if it tried to catch and hold on to and eat each particular small animal that arrived at the plant. Now, the outcome of this, of course, is that the plant is generally free then of small animals that would eat the leaves. Now, we've been talking about what a mature ant colony does for the acacia, but you might well ask, how does the mature ant colony get there in the first place? And basically what happens is that each mature ant colony produces new males and females every day, which leave the acacia about 1 to 2 o'clock in the morning. The queen flies to the top of a tall object like a telephone pole or a tall tree, and she stands motionless on the top of this tall object, opens up her abdomen and releases a pheromone, which is carried downwind. The males are flying about in the general vicinity, and they detect this pheromone, fly upwind, and land on the top of this tree. Now, the male, as soon as he lands on the tree, runs around in tight circles until he bumps into a queen. And I say bump into because this is occurring in the black dark about an hour before sunrise. Now, when he encounters a queen, he jumps on, and copulation takes exactly 10 seconds. And during that time period, he passes enough sperm for her to produce workers for about, well, we think a maximum of 20 years, perhaps longer. And during that time, she may produce easily 200,000 or considerably more workers. Now, once she's been fertilized. She then drops off of the tree, walks around on the ground, and often cuts her wings off or pulls them off in the process, and looks for a young acacia tree. And once she's found a young acacia tree, she goes up to one of the green thorns and cuts an entrance hole in the green thorn, just as a worker will do in her tree later on. She goes inside the thorn, cleans out the thorn, lays her eggs, forages on the acacia for belching bodies and nectar to feed the young developing brood. And this takes her about 6 months to 9 months to get a colony that's big enough so that it can begin to take over these functions for her and patrol the young acacia tree. As the colony grows, once it's established, it eventually becomes very large, and we might get as much as a pint of brood and workers out of one acacia tree. Now, in order to show you one of these colonies here, what I had to do was walk up to a plant in the field, which was about this size, which had a nice healthy colony on it, take a small box, set it down next to the tree, and take a pair of clippers and literally cut each thorn off. Put it in the box, put those thorns in the box, seal it up with tape, bring it back, and hang it in this little bucket at the base of this unoccupied acacia. The ants then come out of these thorns, which you see here, which I had brought back, move into these thorns and establish their colony just as before. Now, these ants that you see running rapidly around the edge of the container are extremely excited, and the reason why they're very excited is because many of them have liberated an alarm pheromone. And when the other workers pick up this alarm pheromone, they begin to run rapidly in all directions. Now, the problem is that we don't know to what degree the workers and brood have moved out of these thorns and into this plant at this particular moment. These have been here for several months. In order to show you the queen, who must be in here somewhere, I'm going to open some of these thorns. And I should say, by way of preface, that commonly on a tree growing in nature, you just pick the biggest thorn, take that thorn off, open it, and there she would be. But since this thing has been moved around a lot, it's a little difficult to know exactly where she is. So my best guess would be to take one of the largest thorns of the tree that I cut originally for this colony and open it up and see if she's inside. Now, this particular thorn is full of brood, full of eggs, and it means that very likely she's inside of this thorn. Now, if we open up the thorn, commonly the contents come out with the rest of the brood. But it looks like this time she's not going to fall out, and so we'll have to go in after her. Now, the way we do that is to simply split the thorn down towards the tip. And yes, there she is. Now, the way we take her out, normally she's able to walk around, as you can see her doing now. But the problem is that she's got a very swollen abdomen, as you can see in comparing with the rest of the workers. But she's still able to drag herself about a bit. Now, she's normally swollen inside of the thorn, and if she wants to move from thorn to thorn, as she must do when the old thorns die and the new ones are produced higher up in the tree, her abdomen becomes less swollen and she stops laying eggs. And then after she's moved to a new thorn, then she swells up again and starts laying eggs. Now, all around her, you can see larvae and belching bodies and eggs. The very tiniest things are the eggs, and then the larvae are slightly larger, and here's a pupa that will eventually produce a worker. The belching bodies are the very small, sort of yellowish objects. Well, now to this point, we have a fairly good idea of what the ant plant looks like with its ants and by itself. Now, I mentioned quite a bit earlier the experiment that was suggested by finding a plant with its top cut off and one without its top cut off. And what I'd like to do now is really show you what happens when you go at this in a specific scientific manner to set up an experiment to demonstrate what effect the ants are having on the plant. Now, the basic experiment was to simply cut down 2,500 trees and remove the tops from them, i.e. we've taken away the ant colony, and the control trees, another 2,500, were cut down and the crowns left by the tree stump. Of course, these all weren't in one huge patch. These were a bunch of different patches in a bunch of different habitats. But at any rate, we then watch what happens to the sucker regeneration from those stumps with an ant colony and without an ant colony. Now, in this picture on the left, you can see a acacia stump, 60 centimeters tall, 45 days after it's been cut down, and an ant colony left by its base. And you can see that it has a large number of big green leaves, nice stems, and if you could look closely, you'd see thorns and belching bodies and this sort of thing. Now, on the right, you can see two stumps which were about 10 meters away from the control plant. And in this case, the ant colony had been removed. And you can see what happened. The plant produced sucker shoots with thorns, and then all the leaves were eaten off. And what happens is the plant continues to produce these sucker shoots, and they continue to have their leaves eaten off. Now, if we then look at the system 9 months later, now remember 9 months is about the time it takes for an ant colony to get established. So in these plants where we removed the ant colony, there will be new colonies starting now after about 9 months. But at any rate, if we look at these plants 9 months later, we find on the left about 2 to 3 meters of sucker shoot growth. And you can see a very large and healthy shoot growing out of the top of this very small stump. On the right-hand side, we have a rather closer photograph of a 65 centimeter stump that didn't have any ants for 9 months. And you can see that it's produced almost no regeneration. Now, that is what happens when you remove the top of the plant. But what if we leave the plant intact and we just plain remove its ants? We can do this by pesticides, or we can do this by mechanically clipping off the thorns. And either way, we end up with a branch structure that has a lot of branches and a lot of thorn bases for things to climb on. Now, on the left, you can see an ordinary control plant with its ant colony. And on the right, you can see a plant that had all of its ants removed, in this particular case with parathion, a quite effective pesticide. And you can see that after 9 months, what's happened is that a local climber has completely covered the plant. You really can't see anything of the acacia. And in fact, these plots were extremely difficult to record because I couldn't find my plants after 9 months. Well, up until this time, we've been talking as though the ants were very effective at keeping everything off of the plant. But in fact, there are a few animals that have gotten around this system. Perhaps one of the more spectacular ones that doesn't hurt the plant very much is the case of birds. There are some birds that build a nest right in the acacia proper. And the way they get around this system is that when the female bird arrives with a bit of nest material, she puts it on the tree, the ants immediately attack it. But she doesn't pay any attention to that. She keeps adding in pieces. The ants keep attacking. But eventually, these pieces accumulate the colony odor. And so to the ants, they become just like the branches on the acacia. And eventually they stop attacking those pieces, and now we have a nest actually built. Well, this is a covered nest with a dark hole inside, and the young and the eggs are inside of that. Well, these ants don't go inside of dark cavities, so there's no problem with the young birds being stung. And when the female bird arrives to feed the young, she lands on the branch with a characteristic weight and bouncing pattern. And when she does this on the acacia, the ants in that general area become acclimated to her particular kind of motion, and therefore they don't attack her. Whereas if I put my hand up there in the same place, I immediately get attacked. Now, that nest probably doesn't do anything to the acacia, and this is an animal who just made use of this system. And what we've been able to show is that the predation on the nests of these birds is much, much lower than on the nests of birds nesting in ordinary plants in the same area. Now, the second example I'd like to give you is that of a moth that has beaten the system by the following manner. What it does is comes along about 4 o'clock in the morning, finds a large leaf on a healthy acacia, grabs a hold of the leaf on the underside and hangs on that leaf. And of course, all the ants in there immediately attack the moth. But the moth has long yellow hairs on it. And the ants get a whole mouthful of hairs when they grab a hold of the moth. And they go marching off with this mouthful of hairs thinking they've actually done something. Well, in fact, what happens is, after a number of ants have done this, there's now a bare spot, and the ant gets through and actually stings the moth. And at that point, the moth lets go and falls off. Now, in the meantime, she's laid 4 or 5 eggs along the underside of the leaf. Now, those eggs then sit there for about 10 days, and apparently during this time, they take up what might be called, best be called, the colony odor. So that when the larvae hatch then, they can march around on the plant, and the ants think of them as being just part of the plant or part of the colony. And what they do is 4 or 5 of them are enough to eat the entire leaf crop off of one plant, except for the shoot tips, because as soon as they start to get close to the shoot tip, the very aggressive workers at the top then attack the caterpillar and drive it back down. Now, if you take this caterpillar off of this acacia and put it on a different acacia with a different ant colony, it's immediately attacked, just as would one of these workers be immediately attacked if it were moved on to the other acacia. So its way of getting around the ants is to absorb the colony odor and become part of the colony and then feed on the plant. Now, there's a third example that we can use. One of them, and this one, is that the caterpillar comes along, finds a thorn with an entrance hole in it, goes inside of the thorn and spins a silken cover over the entrance hole so other ants can't get in. When it gets hungry, it goes out of the thorn, walks along the branch, snips a leaf off at the base, takes the leaf back inside the thorn, and eats it there in peace. Now, when it's outside of the thorn, it's attacked by the ants very vigorously, but the caterpillar has a very smooth and hard outer surface, so the ants can't actually get a hold of the caterpillar. So that's the way it survives outside of the thorn. But now and then, an ant gets through the thorn entrance. And when it does that, it attacks the caterpillar inside the thorn, and there he's more pinned down. And the way he kills the ant then is to take fluid from his salivary glands and actually spit. And if the caterpillar has attacked him here, he just reaches around and spits a little drop of it on it, and that kills the ant instantly. It only takes a second or two. So the inside of this thorn then will be littered with 2 or 3 or 4 ant carcasses from those occasional ants who've gotten inside of the system. Now, we could go on and enumerate about a dozen other insects who've managed some way to get around the ants. But really, all this does is illustrate the general problem that all plants have some sort of protection. And this protection, normally, in most plants, is chemicals. And the ones you're familiar with are things like nicotine in tobacco plants and morphine coming out of the opium poppy and tannin in oak leaves. And the difficult thing about those plants is that you can't walk up to an oak tree and go poof and take all the tannins out of the leaves and then see what happens to that plant when it doesn't have its normal chemical defenses. But the nice thing about the acacia tree is we can walk up and either with a pesticide or by some other manipulation, as we mentioned earlier, you can remove the ant colony and see what happens to the plant, because this plant doesn't have the normal chemical defenses that an ordinary plant has, and the ants are serving completely in that role.